we were discussing about the Suez Canal crisis, which turned out to be another, you can say, which consolidated actually the Israeli position in Middle East, because Israel dominated its position, and it regained what it lost, a very important access to Red Sea and other areas, Indian Ocean, from the Gulf of Aqaba. So actually, this was very important for incident um, for the Israelis. It's okay, no problem. No. Okay, so moving forward, another important thing which took place in Middle East was 1967 war between the Arabs and the Israelis, and this was very important. And what happened actually? The Arabs actually they were preparing for an offensive against Israelis, just to take back the Palestinian areas and just dislodge the Israelis from their positions. So after a period of relative calm, since 1947-48, the border incidents between Israel and Syria, Egypt, and Jordan increased during the early 1960s. With Palestinian guerrilla groups actively supported by Syria, they have been, involved in violence against the Israelis. So Israel was actually surrounded by hostile nations, and they were trying to, create serious troubles for this newly born state, which was not that strong at that time, but still they were quite strong. In May 1967, the president Jamal Nasser, his prestige much eroded through his inaction in the face of Israeli raids, because Israelis they used to carry out hot pursuit operations in border areas. Whenever any terrorist group used to attack from these areas, they used to follow them. And this is what we call hot pursuit, and they used to attack these. They used to carry out cross raids, which actually provoked the Egyptian leader, and he requested the withdrawal of the UN forces from Egyptian territory, and he started mobilization in the Sinai Peninsula area of Egypt, and closed the Gulf of Aqaba again to Israel. Now, Gulf of Aqaba, as I told you before, was very important for the Israelis. You need to understand and relate these things when you are answering a question. You are not going to take just one side that the Israelis are, outrightly doing all these things in, madness. Actually, Israeli had associated, political, economic, and strategic value to these areas, and Israelis wanted to secure their own interest, just like the other states. So Gulf of Aqaba was again close to Israel, and it was, as I told you before, it was the only area from where the Israelis could get access to Red Sea and then to Indian Ocean region. So Israelis, could never accept this. And what happened? Israel also then, after realizing this fact, that now they have to take this, issue into their own hand. So they carried out, preemptive strike on the and which crippled the air capability of the Arabs. And this was the time when it was a massive air assault, and the Arab, their air capabilities were totally destroyed, especially the Syrian and the Egyptians. They could not carry out any significant attack against Israel after that. Why? Because it was a preemptive strike, and with air superiority protecting its ground forces, Israel also, controlled the Sinai Peninsula within 3 days, and then concentrated on the Jordanian frontier. They also, captured some areas in Jordan, and then recapture, capturing the Jerusalem's old city, and on the Syrian border, gaining the strategic Golan Heights, which were controlled by the Syrians. So this was also very important for the Syrians. So basically, it was a very, very decisive victory for the Israelis, in which they gained a lot of territory after the, much beyond territory than the 1948 situation. So it was a great victory for Israel, and it was a great, you can say, defeat, you can say, for the Arab countries, They could not, protect themselves from, and they could not predict that Israel would carry out such an offensive. In 1967 Arab-Israel War, it was also called as a Six-Day War, basically. In this war, the Jewish nation, Israelis, they they um, they control territory, 4 times its previous size. So they got more and more land, especially from Egyptians. They got Sinai Peninsula, which was about 23,000, square kilometer area, square mile area. It was a huge area, slightly bigger than Fatah even today. And the Gaza Strip, of course, that was also captured by the Israelis. Jordan lost West Bank and East Jerusalem, which was previously controlled by these states. And Syria also lost the strategic Golan Heights, which were very important for the Syrians. So it was a decisive victory for the Israelis. And as you can see in this map as well, before and after the Six-Day War, as you can see, before the Israelis had a very few area, but after 1967 they got more areas, especially the Golan Heights were captured, the West Bank was captured, the Sinai Peninsula was captured, and then of course Gaza Strip was also captured by the Israelis. So it was again a great victory for the Israelis, and which consolidated the Israel's position in this region. If you analyze the losses, if you compare the losses, Israelis almost, they lost about 1,000 men, and they also lost about 400 tanks and 46 aircraft. Whereas on the Arab side, the losses were much greater. For example, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, collectively they lost more than 18,000 people in this war, and they also lost about 452 aircraft. Now, this was actually a huge setback for the Arab Air Force, because the Israeli Air Force totally dominated, and they initially had, aircraft from the US and Britain and other countries. So basically, they had superior technology, which helped them in getting a swift victory against the Arabs. If you analyze the total strength of the Arab troops, it was considerable. About 240,000 were deployed, and on the other side, the Israelis also deployed 100,000 troops. But Israelis, they enjoyed technological edge over the Arabs, and because of the support of the Britain and US in technological terms and the satellite imagery and other things, it was quite effective against the Arabs. So because of their superior intelligence, because of their real-time information, and because of their greater strategies, they totally outnumber the Arabs when it comes to the 67 war. So it was a decisive victory for the Israelis. After 1967, this matter was also taken up by the United Nations Security Council, and a very important resolution was passed in 1967. And this resolution was called as 242, which talks about that withdrawal of the Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, and respect for an acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and their right in the to live in peace within secure. So this was actually a very important, you can say, a resolution by the United Nations Security Council, which was accepted by all, and Israel was liable to accept this. But till to date, the Israelis could not accept this. Another important event, which 1967, after 1967, which led to 1973 war, was the unjust occupation of Israel over the areas of Egypt, Syria, and of course the Jordan, and of course the Palestinian lands. So 1973, Yom Kippur is a religious day in the Israeli Jewish calendar, and this is one of the most holiest days. And now the Egyptians, they secretly planned to carry out a very surprise attack on the Israeli troops, especially in the Sinai Peninsula area, which was captured by Israel, and it was basically previously it was part of the Egypt. So, but the Syrians, barely they got some areas in Golan Heights, but the Egyptians, they got Sinai Peninsula area, and they pushed the Israeli forces out of this area. So it was a surprising, you can say, attack by the Egyptians. So ultimately, a ceasefire took place because of the U.S. interference and the Soviets interference, and Israel, was saved by the United States of America, because the United States of America provided them with real-time information, space imagery, and the spy satellites, वगैरह की जो भी help थी, they provided, to the Israelis, and Israelis were saved from total annihilation, total, you can say, annihilation. So this was, a wake-up call for the Israelis as well, because after this war, they were exposed from their weaknesses as well, and they realized after that now they should think for, in a real sense, for to get ultimate weapon, and that is nuclear weapon. But according to reports, after 1960s, the Israelis started acquiring nuclear weapons, and it is also reported that by 1967, Israel had 2 crude bombs ready, which could be delivered through trucks to the border areas. And in case if the Egyptian forces outnumber the Israelis, and if the Israelis were to lost their territory, huge area, or their state, so this was their last resort. So, but they could not, do it, because the ceasefire took place and situation again calmed down. But 1973 was a decisive year, or you can say decisive war for the Israelis, because it was a surprising attack by the Egyptian forces, and Israel almost they could have lost, but they were saved by the United States of America. So this Israel's victory came at the cost of heavy casualties, because if they suffered huge casualties because of the surprise attack, and the element of surprise which the Egyptians achieved provided them edge in the beginning, but later on, with the, as I told you before, with the support of the US, they survived. So in April 1974, the Prime Minister of Israel, she was very popular, Golda Meir, and she had to step down from the position because of the humiliation, because of the people, they questioned the preparedness of the Israeli forces. So basically, it was an element of surprise which the Israelis never expected, and this was their failure. So for Syria, the Yom Kippur War was a disaster. Why it was a disaster? Because the Egyptians, they actually carried out a ceasefire with the Israelis, and they started peaceful negotiations with Israelis, and which was a great betrayal for the Arab states, because the Egypt was the most important country, the most powerful country bordering Israel, and the Egyptians could play a very decisive role in the future settlement of this issue. But the problem was that the Egyptians, they directly negotiated with Israel, and they realized that now they cannot defeat Israel because of the United States of America, and Britain, and of course the France. These countries actually favored and they backed the Israelis, and they also supported Israel politically, economically, and diplomatically. So Egyptians, they took this decision, and they decided now they are going to improve their ties with the Israelis. If you analyze the 1973 war, it was a huge, you can say, disaster for the Israelis, because they lost about almost 3,000 men. They also lost about 1,000 tanks, 407 APCs, armored personnel carrier vehicles, and of course, they lost a huge number of aircraft, which was close to 400. So this was the defeat. You can say it was they actually defended themselves, but the losses were huge. On the other side, the Egyptians and the other Muslim countries who were involved in this, they also suffered significant losses. Like, for example, 18,000 plus people were killed in, overall. About 2,300 tanks were also destroyed because they had huge tanks inventory. More than 500 aircraft were destroyed by the Egyptians, Syrians, and other countries of this region. And of course, the 19 naval warships were also sunk by the Israeli forces. Now, another important thing which took place at that time was the oil embargo. The Arabs, they used oil as a weapon, and because, as you know, that the OPEC was also dominated by the Arab countries, um, they reduced the oil production by 5%, um, and this was a huge setback for the, you can say, US and, European countries, because they were totally dependent on the oil supplies from the Middle East. So after the, President of the United States of America, Nixon, when he authorized a major allocation of arms supplies and a funding of about $2.2 billion to Israel, so automatically the Arab countries, led by Saudi Arabia, they imposed oil embargo on the, European economies, and of course the US economy. And this was, considered as a, huge setback for the, global economic growth, especially the US and their allies, European allies. So United States of America at that time suffered um, huge setbacks, economic setbacks, and that was the lesson for the US and the European countries, especially for the US. And after that, you have seen that the United States of America, even today, they maintained huge presence in the Muslim area, especially in the Middle East region, West Asia region. Now, if you analyze today, they have got huge number of troops deployed in Saudi Arabia, 3,000, Bahrain, 7,000, Qatar, 10,000. Then you got Oman, UAE, 5,000 troops, Kuwait, 13,000 troops, Iraq, 5,000 troops, and many other states. So now, after the experience of 1973, they ensured that this region is never, they never, they ensured the oil supplies, is continued. And because of their presence, no country is now going to put oil embargo against them. Another important significance of, having their forces there in this region also ensured that the Saudi Iranians, they also wanted to block this region of Strait of Hormuz, especially during the 2009 period when the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he had, direct clashes with the Israelis. So at that time, he threatened that he is going to block the Strait of Hormuz. And as we all know, that the importance of Strait of Hormuz is, huge. Why? Because 90% of the oil supplies from the GCC states, it passed through the Strait of Hormuz. So if this region is blocked, for example, in modern times, if you block the Strait of Hormuz region, automatically the Chinese economy, which is 80% dependent on the Strait of Hormuz, Western economies like the European economies, they are 65% dependent on this region. Japanese, they are dependent on, 75%, and the South Koreans are the same number. So most of the economies, the Japanese, Europeans, and South Koreans, they are, close allies of the United States of America. And of course, the Chinese are also dependent on this region. So now Americans, they ensured being here in this region that no country would ever put oil embargo. Plus, no country is allowed, especially the Iranians, that they are not going to block this region, because the Americans, they have got a huge military presence in this region. So this was the historical, you can say, linkage with the modern times. And in the next class, we are going to discuss in detail about the peace accords which took place after this